Audio Unleashed.
All right, it's time to amp it up. Time to make it happen. Time to rev up the energy. Time for the Audio
Unleashed
podcast.
Yeah.
It's a good intro, huh?
That was a good intro, man. That was one of your best.
I'm a pro, man. I can just turn it on instantaneously. I can go from 0 to 10.
I usually need you to drag me along with you. Yeah.
All right. We got high energy. What else we got besides high energy? Anything else?
Yeah, we got some articles to talk about, and we are going to start with, I just realized something as I was reading over our idea board. We've got a decent smattering of mainstream audio coverage here. And we're going to start with an article from The Atlantic, of all places, by Michael Owen. And the headline is, Bluetooth speakers are ruining music. You have 2 ears for a reason. I think you could probably tell where this article is going from the headline alone.
Yeah.
Although maybe not. You might be wrong. You might underestimate just how much he ends up talking about his own musical predilections than actual, reproduction of music. But whatever. I mean, it's you get the gist of where it's going from the headline. But I think we're going to have a lot to show in there, a lot to dig into, and oddly enough, that is going to set up the next two topics in a strange sort of way. So what are we going to talk about after that?
Well, the next topic, looking over the, I'm going to call it our vision board.
Oh,
how's that?
Okay.
That sounds a lot more, corporate. As we're a growing corporation. We're not a corporation. We're not really growing, but whatever.
It's corporate. I was thinking it sounded more hippie. Like I'm going to need to start taking peyote before we record or something.
No, it's just something that
like I was thinking Vision Quest, man.
A vision board is something that corporations that don't really have anything to sell come up with.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right.
So
I don't like it.
Since we don't really have much to sell,
man.
All right. Well, whatever. I've not done that in my life. So, but since you're a Grateful Dead fan, I assume you've done that. So, I cannot speak with any authority on it. All I can speak with authority about is the things I assume you have done. So, this article that we're going to talk about is from the dynamic, talented, and ubiquitous John Darko, the king of all audio media, kind of.
Whoa.
I think he kind of is. I think he's more, in my view, he's more important than Stereophile and Absolute Sound put together.
Wow.
His audience is probably bigger. I'm sure it's a lot bigger, but and also probably far less annoying. But anyway,
don't have to work hard for that.
This article that John wrote, it's not one of his videos, it's an article, is the most important hi-fi component is your room. That's the headline. That got me curious and thinking. And so I read this article, and it's actually, I was kind of expecting like kind of a blah, blah. Well, I think blah, 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 blah. But it's actually a pretty scientifically oriented article. And it's basically a very kind of condensed version of stuff, Floyd Toole says. And stuff that's in the Master Handbook of Acoustics. And, which is sort of the generally accepted Bible of this sort of stuff. But it's a long article, and it's got a lot of really, really useful knowledge, I think, for audiophiles. However, I took exception to the conclusion of it, which I don't know if you did, but I'm just kind of like, wait, what? And the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from all the wonderful scientific information he presented, in my opinion. But we'll talk about that.
Okay.
And we'll have fun talking about it.
Yeah. Cool.
It'll be an upbeat, energetic conversation, as people have come to expect from the Audio
Unleashed
podcast.
Yeah.
So what's next?
Next, I was kind of shocked. I was, people might have picked up on the fact that I've been spending a lot of time not at home lately, a lot of medical stuff going on. I've been sort of nursing my dad back to health and spending a lot of time at his house. But needless to say, at his house, there's not a lot to keep you entertained other than YouTube videos about tractors and chainsaws. So I've been reading a good bit. And one of the magazines I always pick up when I'm at Books A Million is American Scientist. It's really good science journalism, which there's not a lot of these days. Mainstream science journalism is dodgy at best, but American Scientist is always really good. But I was reading the new issue and I came across this article that was kind of surprising to see in sort of a mainstream publication called The Science of Hi-Fi Audio. It is by John G. Behrens and Richard Van Everdingen. And basically I'll just read the deck for you because this kind of gives it away. Despite great advances in quantifying sound quality, engineers are still struggling to satisfy the subjective ways listeners respond to music. So 30,000 foot view here, he talks about the fact that it's like very easy with speech reproduction to objectively test it and listen to it and qualify it. And then pretty much everybody subjectively goes, yes, that is good speech reproduction. But with music, it's not quite that way. You do all of the objective stuff that you can, and there's still sort of a shotgun approach to whether people are going to subjectively agree that it is high quality. And one of the biggest things is sort of this concept of immersiveness. And they talk about why it's a problem, and they talk about, honestly, sort of their approach to addressing the problem. There's a lot going on here, a lot to discuss. In my opinion, there's some noise in the signal, but I just thought it was really neat to see this subject being discussed in a mainstream science publication.
Yeah, I was a little surprised. I think it's kind of a little almost quaint in a lot of ways. That like, wow, this feels like a 1990s problem. Being discussed 30 years later.
Yeah.
In a way.
In a way. And there's a lot of bad faith, I think, reactions to this article. And I think we might talk about one of them.
Oh, we'll talk about one of them for sure.
Okay. All right. Anyway, what are we going to do for our patrons this week, man? They're the ones keeping the lights on.
Well, for them, we push all the super technical stuff to the bottom of the Audio Unleashed vision board. And, but we found an article. Well, we didn't find it. It's just there. We didn't dig deep into the, cavernous realm of the internet to find this because it was written by a friend of ours, Jeff Morrison. And
also he texted me a link to it and was like, hey, you guys should talk about this.
Yeah, he texted me a link too. So, yeah. But anyway, he's right. We should talk about it. And so it's about MEMS, which is micro electrical mechanical systems. Is that right?
Microelectrical mechanical systems, yeah. And then oddly enough, microelectrical mechanical is one word, but it gets several letters in the acronym or initialism.
Wow. Okay.
So,
and what these things are is they're basically, we're used to integrated circuits that are just circuits. There's no moving parts on them, but MEMS are things that are manufactured on roughly the scale and using some of the techniques of integrated circuits, but they actually have moving parts. And he went to a CES booth to check out some of this stuff. And it was it was interesting to me because I did an article, which we'll also link to in Audio Express. I think it was about a year and a half ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, about some earphones, some like, what do they call them? Reference design earphones, which are in the realm of audio manufacturing and design. A reference design means something that a technology company has created as a standard for manufacturers to go by. And so anyway, this company, USound, introduced MEMS earphones, and Audio Express asked me to run my tests on them, which involve a lot of measurements, and to see if these were any, viable. And I did. And, that was a couple of years ago. That was now actually 3 years ago I wrote that article. And, based on I was shocked to read Jeff's article and see how much has happened in the world of MEMS. And it's taken like giant leaps. So it's pretty exciting and interesting to read about. And we're going to talk about it.
Very cool. Let's start with this Atlantic article, though, buddy. And I want to start by asking you a question, because you write a lot about Bluetooth speakers. You do a lot of the testing for Bluetooth speakers for the New York Times, Wirecutter. I think have fairly well earned a reputation as being the person that's doing the most real objective journalism about Bluetooth speakers out there. Why do you hate music so bad, Brent?
2 words. The Eagles.
So we got to burn it all down because of the Eagles, huh?
I would say that the 2 most horrifying words in the English language are the Eagles. But that would mean the is one of the most horrifying words in the English language.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't make a lot of sense, would it?
Pretty broad. Yeah. We don't want to be eliminating the definite article here. So
yeah. So anyway, I don't, and I love music, and that's partly, I embrace these things. Honestly, I still remember the first one I got. I think it was from Sound Matters, which is a company that I think still exists. And they kind of invented the Bluetooth speaker, the sort of compact Bluetooth speaker with the passive radiator, which has become kind of the industry standard design for small Bluetooth speakers and even larger ones. And they kind of invented that and actually licensed it to some other people and manufactured stuff and designed stuff for other people. But I remember the first time they had sent me their little Foxhole speaker, and it just had a 3.5 millimeter line input. So I plugged it into my phone. I was like, oh, great. Okay. And then they sent me a Bluetooth version. I was kind of like, well, what do you do with that? Because I think at the time I didn't have a smartphone even.
Wow.
So I didn't, the idea of playing music off my phone was kind of new. And, but I kind of got into it, and like a year later, I did a roundup of, probably most of the Bluetooth speakers that were available at the time for sound and vision. It was probably 8 or 10 of them. And, and I've been really into it ever since then, because it's just such a convenient way to listen to music, and they can be good. There's a lot of, I got to tell you, the amount of engineering and technology that goes into a typical good Bluetooth speaker, like what JBL makes, just for example, is, I think, way more than what goes into a typical 2-way speaker, which, frankly, if you just get any of a number of speaker design programs, or you learn to do the math out of the Loudspeaker Design Cookbook, it's not that hard to build a good speaker. But building a good Bluetooth speaker where you're pushing all these elements to their limits because you want something that's portable or cheap or both, is a lot more interesting and challenging. And there's a lot of fails, but there's a lot of successes as well. So, and I listen to, look, you can tell me how much I don't know about music, except my knowledge of music is demonstrable, which is not true of most audio writers. And through my albums with my partner, Ron Seiger, which you can check out on Bandcamp, and we'll put the link, blah, blah, blah. I'm so self-promotional. It's the times, man. But anyway, I enjoy listening to music on the better of these. There's some that are really bad, let's face it. But I took exception with a great deal of the things that this guy had to say. And I got to say, first of all, the Atlantic. Okay. I mean, for many people, that's enough said. But I'm not gonna make an ad hominem attack here. Well, I just did.
Right.
That's not the only attack I'm going to make.
That's not the substance of your attack.
But anyway, these magazines tend to, and I've been on the edges of this. I mean, I've written for some mainstream magazines here and there, and I've known a lot of editors who do. And so much of, these articles tend to get assigned by by editors who are not really into the subject matter. They just want a cultural commentary of some sort.
Yeah.
And no one involved with this article, I would guess, has any significant involvement in music. They don't play. They're not audiophiles, that's for sure. And, there are people that want to listen to whatever. And so they're kind of coming at it from that point of view, which is okay. But I would argue the people that are just kind of want to listen to whatever and have some music going in the background are not going to read an article about that in the Atlantic.
Well, I would say a lot of what Michael Owen writes here, though, falls into so many of the audiophile cliche traps that frustrate me. So, I mean, it's for one thing, he just takes forever to get to the point. He starts by talking about, Brian Wilson's smile and, the textures of it and listening to it in his car and then seeing a performance at the Hollywood Bowl and talking about the sonic difference. I mean, it takes a while to sort of get to the point.
It really does.
You eventually figure out that what he's on about is this sort of migration from mono to stereo in recorded music. It takes some digging to understand that's sort of the journey that he's taking and the path that he's putting us on. But, look, that's interesting. In and of itself, it's interesting. But he somehow finds a way to make it very, very not interesting.
Well, I thought it was interesting just in that I find it informative just to know, as an audio writer, I find it informative to find out somebody else's point of view, but just to show you how far this guy is from audiophiles, and from the intended audience of the Audio
Unleashed
podcast. I'm just going to quote, "I don't think I've ever felt a greater sense of space than at Beyonce's show in the Superdome 2 Septembers ago." I am going to say that there are exceptionally few audiophiles that would go to a Beyonce show.
That's a good point.
That would listen to Beyonce or go to any kind of a show that big. I know a lot of audiophiles, and very few of them would go to some show in the Superdome, for God's sake. That's not about music. That's about a communal experience, which is perfectly fine, right? But it's not about music. I've been in the Superdome, and it was a communal experience, because this will mean a lot to you because I know how into sports you are. I got to see, and this is quite some years ago, but I was watching the New Orleans Jazz, and I saw Pete Maravich score 50 points in one night. It's pretty impressive. But anyway, and it was a communal experience. We all enjoyed it. Did it have anything to do with music? No.
Which sport is that? I don't know what sport the Jazz plays.
That's the one where they throw the ball through the hoop.
Basketball. Okay, gotcha.
Okay. Oh, you knew the name of it. Good. Okay, good. That's a lot of tall people play it, but
don't be fatuous.
They're closer to the hoop. So,
wait, what was that? The potato guy. The potato guy was short, wasn't he?
I don't remember. Spud McKenzie. Yeah.
And or
something.
That was the target. That was the dog. Yeah,
that was the dog. Okay, whatever. No. Whatever. Okay, we're very confused and we're very far off topic. But my point is, you go to the Superdome for a communal experience, whether it's communal love of sports or communal love of whatever kind of music, or just communal love of the community, right? Just being around a bunch of people. I like to go to football games. You may surprise you, football and baseball games once in a while, just to be around lots of people and kind of savor the excitement. But it has nothing to do with music, and audiophiles are into music, and audiophiles like to listen to music at home by and large, because that's what you do. And so I think this has very little to do with home listening. He says, but our everyday communal experience of music has suffered. But I gotta say, audiophiles, outside of audiophile clubs, of which there are many, audiophiles kind of mostly listen to music at home, and it's not a communal experience.
That is a big shame, in my opinion. I mean, there's just nothing in the world for me that is better than sitting next to someone, sharing music with them in the room. I mean, it is just there are few human endeavors that are more intimate and more invigorating and more rewarding, in my opinion, than just sharing your music with someone in the same acoustical space. I think that's one of the reasons that you and I have talked before about headphones versus stereo systems, whatever. It's just like I spend a lot of time listening to headphones, like most people do, but it's. Ooh, can I get risque here? It's kind of masturbatory. Whereas, actually sharing your music with someone in a space, it feels like a real meaningful connection. So I think audiophiles are missing out with their, one seat very carefully placed in the sweet spot. And look, I think they're into the special effects. They're not into the story, if you want to accept a weird analogy there.
Everything you said in the last minute is wrong.
Okay.
But
why?
Because why do I want to share music with people? I mean, I like to go to a jazz club or something, right? That's fun. But, because you're seeing the artists and stuff. And you don't know, especially with a jazz show, you never know exactly what to expect. I shouldn't say that. You rarely know exactly what to expect. If you go to David Benoit show or something like that, just mentioning that because I'm learning one of his tunes right now. There's not a lot of improvisation there. It's pretty by the book. But like most jazz shows, there's a lot of improvisation and there's a lot of train wrecks, and they're reaching for the stars and falling short, but they're trying, and it's more fun that way. But in terms of listening with other people, I don't ever do that.
I mean, some of my favorite memories of me and you are of listening to music together, man.
Well, that's different.
So many times, me and you sitting in your what was your cigar lounge at your place in Canoga Park, and you're like, oh, you got to hear this, and you and me taking road trips and going, oh God, you got to hear this song, and it's very different from me sending you a text to a link to Qobuz saying I would like for you to hear this music. Like the first time I played Tool for you, and I got to actually see you react to that music in real time. That is one of my favorite memories of the two of us. It's one of my favorite road trip memories of the two of us. So I don't know, man. It's kind of a big deal for me to share music with you in an actual space.
Well, that's nice to hear. I mean, I certainly on our road trips, I have certainly enjoyed you playing music for me and saying, "Oh, you got to hear this," and me saying, "Like, that's all they got."
To be fair, I think when you said that it was about Skrillex. So
I can do that crap in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But I got to say, he kills his own argument here because he says, or I should say the headline writers killed his argument because, usually the headline's not written by the writer.
Of course.
So, the headline is basically Bluetooth speakers suck. He says, for Christmas, I ordered a pair of $60 Bluetooth speakers. And, so they paired them in stereo and they took them out to the fire pit and they hung them from opposite trees. Okay. Kind of a headphone effect, I guess. And, you could hear the silence of the stage open up. And, the music seemed to come not from a single point on the ground like we were used to, but from somewhere out in the woods or up in the sky, or maybe from a time all before this when the musician was blah, 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 whatever. And, there wasn't a stereo sweet spot. And the bass left something to be desired, but the sound made a space and we were in it together. Okay, fine. So get a pair of Bluetooth speakers and pair them, because I would say 98% of them can be paired now. And do that if that turns you on. But, you could an audiophile could write an answer article, and get a beef going and maybe even get a Grammy Award. And see how plugged in I am? You'd think I didn't know that. But so you could, but an audiophile could write an article that says basically, well, dude, that's stupid because you're sitting in the middle of the performers and that's not what they intend. Music recordings, almost all of them, 90, 99% are made, from the perspective of someone in an audience looking at a performer on a stage. And, so you have distorted the intended effect just to get this sort of big sound. And it's sort of like, stoner kids in the 70s would like put their speakers like on the ground and they'd like lay in between them.
Yeah.
I remember that. Or they put, back in the days when hardly anyone had any clue how to set up a stereo, including a lot of the people that made them. You put one speaker in the corner and the other speaker in the other corner, in the opposite corner,
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of people did that. And it's not, this is not recreating any kind of, live music experience. It's just adding more space, which we will be talking about more soon in a few minutes. But I basically it's such a weird mixed message here in that he's going to all this trouble to basically say we need to have more than one speaker, except, like I said, every Bluetooth speaker on the market pretty much can be paired and they're cheap. And a lot of them are really shockingly good. I mean, I've had several. I've had models from, say, Sony that were like $250 or something that were certainly pretty much as good as a small stereo system from a fidelity standpoint, not from a spaciousness standpoint, but from a fidelity standpoint. And, that's a miracle to me. And you could buy two and you'd have a decent system. And he's kind of, he's complaining about, speakers that, let you buy more toilet paper. It's like, well, that doesn't make it a bad speaker.
Right.
I have the Amazon Echo Studio, as you do too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Although I think I'm probably getting rid of it soon. I'm really tired of Amazon.
All right. Well, I am too, but they're a necessary evil in my view, certainly for me. But, that's a good sounding speaker. And the fact that I can, I basically almost never order anything through it. I have ordered maybe 5 things through it. And the whole time I've had it, I must have had it for 4 or 5 years now. And, it's just a speaker and I tell it to play stuff and it plays stuff and it sounds good and it has decent bass and it actually has a nice sense of spaciousness because it has an upward firing driver. It's Atmos compatible if you're playing an Atmos source. Not that it's a faithful presentation of Atmos as whoever heard it in the studio, but it's more spacious sounding. And I just think this kind of reflects, I don't know. It's just a weird article. And I kind of hate it when people come into, like every other writer who's a writer within a certain niche. I hate it when people that haven't taken the time to learn anything about the field start mouthing off about it in The Atlantic. I mean, I pretty much hate everything that people mouth off about The Atlantic at this point. But
we should play a game here. We should look. We both know he didn't write this headline. What we should try to do is guess what headline he actually had on the article when he submitted it. I'm going to propose 1 speaker bad, 2 speaker good. What do you think? What do you think his working headline was?
That's pretty good. I think his working headline was, in effect, I don't know exactly what it was, but in effect, it was why you should listen to music the way I prefer to. There you go. Nope, you win. Ding, ding, ding. Which is basically the same, the headline that pretty much fits every article on audio pretty much ever written almost. Yeah. So, I'm sure you and I have both written articles like that. So
I think we've said enough words about this one. So you want to take a break and get some water and come back and talk about Darko?
Let's talk about Darko and let's put The Atlantic to bed for a long, long time.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. All right, we'll be right back.
And we're back. This is Audio
Unleashed.
And we're going to talk about one of our favorite audio writers and personalities. Well, we're not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about what he said.
Yeah.
And that person is John Darko, who does darko.audio. And also, very popular YouTube channel and a pretty good podcast. And he's over in Europe. He's not one of us. He's from the UK. He lives in Berlin and somewhere in Portugal as well. So he's basically living the life we would live if we weren't losers. So, whatever. Anyway, he has this article that's entitled, and he has talked a lot about acoustics. So few audio writers have talked about acoustics. So bravo to John for talking about this. And the article is entitled, "The Most Important Hi-Fi Component is Your Room." Okay. And I feel like he wrote this just to hook people in. Certainly me, because it did hook me in. Although I read his site a lot because, in my view, if you want good general news and if you want to find out what's going on in the audio industry, go to darko.audio. He's got his finger on the pulse of what's really happening that normal people would be interested in, as opposed to some of these other sites are like, Stereophile's like, oh, this new $50,000 amplifier I got, and it's not as good as the $100,000 amplifier from the same company, but the benefits of the trickle-down technology are evident, and so it's surprisingly close. I mean, I could just dictate these reviews.
Yep.
You really don't. I could use the dictating thing in my phone and write this crap. And
whereas Darko was the first person I ever saw write about WIM, which is
true.
Let's face it, one of the really biggest names in audio these days. Yeah,
he is really hip to what's really going on in audio without as much of a. He's not all those magazines or former magazines now, websites, whatever, are so focused on selling you on audio, and he's really not like that. So good stuff. Anyway, so I thought this was going to be like, the most important hi-fi component is your room. And it was going to be like, basically, I'm John Darko and I'm an audio expert. And, you should, buy a bunch of acoustic stuff. But it's not like that at all. Well, maybe at the end a little bit. But he really, this is like a condensed version of a lot of what Floyd Toole writes about in the loudspeaker. No, that's Vance. Floyd Toole wrote the sound reproduction, the psychoacoustics of loudspeakers in rooms. Is that it?
Yeah. The acoustics and psychoacoustics, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I can see the book from here, but my eyes aren't good enough to read the title. But yes.
Okay. Well,
sound reproduction.
Floyd's indisputably one of the great audio scientists of all time. He's not necessarily one of the best book title writers of all time.
Oh, yeah.
Shorter titles would be good.
I'm eagerly awaiting the new edition of the book. So maybe it's got a shorter title.
Shorten the title. But anyway, So John talks about, it's basically, this is a really great article. It's a great summation of all the basics of acoustics. And he talks about how different frequencies of sound work differently in a room. And, have we talked about the Schroeder frequency? We must have.
Surely we have.
Okay, well, basically the idea...
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we kind of... we talked about it last episode, I think, when we were talking about AI with regard to audio, like where could AI actually be useful? And I said, like, it would be good in actually looking at different measurements of like, when you're doing room correction, look at all of the measurements and figure out where the Schroeder frequency of your room is and do more below that than above it. So, yeah, we talked about it last episode. Yeah.
But he writes about this in just such nice, plain language. And, he talks about how, your room is reverberant above a certain frequency and your room is a resonator below that frequency. And he also talks about how, it's not an on-off thing. It's like a gradual transition. And he talks about reverb time, the difference between reverb and echo, which are very commonly used, they're terms that are used interchangeably and shouldn't be. And he talks about the difference between, diffusers and reflectors and absorbers. And he talks about, he kind of talks about like all the fundamental basics of the one thing I think he doesn't talk about is, which Floyd Toole does talk about, and a lot of the audio treatment industry, the acoustical treatment industry does not talk about, is, the importance of having big stuff as your acoustic treatment. Because there's acoustical treatment products that are, I don't know, half an inch thick or whatever. Right. And, as Floyd Toole points out in his book, you need much thicker stuff than that. If you have absorptive stuff, you need at least like 4 inches because, the little 2-inch stuff doesn't get the lower frequencies of the human voice. Correct. And stuff, things kind of start to sound shouty if you get a lot of this sort of thin stuff. There are people like Tony Grimani who have created products that are thinner that will actually be more effective down to lower frequencies. Mm-hmm. But, that's a really important, they're not cheap, but, guys got to make a living, but you can do good acoustic. If you don't mind them not looking great, you can do pretty good acoustic treatments with stuff that's available cheap on Amazon or even at Home Depot. Yeah. And I've done that. I've actually written about that.
One of my first encounters with Anthony Grimani was writing an article for Electronic House, which is sadly, the article's no longer around anywhere, but it was just DIY acoustics hacks you can do, for basically no money. That's how Anthony and I became friends working on that article.
Yeah. Well, I mean, John does point out here, he says DIY panel builders pay more with time than cash, but time is money.
Yeah.
Well, not if you're retired. But down towards the bottom of the article, it gets a little weird to me. In the section where he's got knives, it says knives out. I'm not sure why that was his headline. But because he doesn't really have the knife out for anybody.
No.
But he is saying here, though, mirroring his headline, and he did write the headline, I'm sure. Dudes who have their own websites usually write their own headlines. Okay. But writers for The Atlantic or Wirecutter typically do not, big fancy publications. So, he does say, the room is arguably the single most dominant factor in what we hear from our loudspeakers. It has more of an impact than any upstream hi-fi component. But I got to say, here's a thought exercise. I have 2 thought exercises for you, Dennis.
Oh, fun.
Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Thought exercise number 1.
Mm-hmm.
What will sound better? A really crappy speaker in a good room or a really good speaker in a bad room?
A really good speaker in a bad room is going to sound much better. I mean, unless it's just a horrendous room. I mean, if you're literally putting it in your bathtub, I don't think it matters. But
if the room is made of solid glass all around, well, the bad speaker's still going to sound in a good room, still going to sound worse because you're going to have coloration. Like you might have coloration like this and stuff like that. The room is not going to do. The room does not impart the kind of really objectionable colorations, I think, that a bad speaker does. Because a bad speaker will have objectionable colorations, that are easily measurable, easily audible, right in the voice range, right in the mid range where the crossover between the woofer and tweeter is, which is where people, that are not really good loudspeaker designers make their mistakes.
Yeah.
Or a lot of these, single driver speakers that are popular with audiophiles, which, in my view, if you have a single driver speaker that's 3.5 inches, maybe even 4, those can actually sound pretty good because the dispersion doesn't narrow too much at high frequencies and they don't have a lot of high frequency coloration. But a lot of these bigger ones, an 8 or 10 inch driver with a whizzer cone in the middle that's supposed to work as a quasi tweeter. I've never heard one of those sound good. And I've actually built some of those myself. I've tested a few. I just heard one of them in a shop literally on Saturday down here in Seattle, called Turntables and Trails. They sell vintage audio gear and hiking gear. It was a super ultra cool shop. You would have liked it a great deal. And they had a big giant old golden retriever there that was walking around snuggling out to everybody. It was just such a great scene. But anyway, they had, I'm not going to name the manufacturer because they were kind of like, yeah, we got this in. And I'm like, well, that's a popular brand. You'll sell it fast. The guy's like, yeah, I know. But he's like, it just doesn't sound good. And these things that they have a lot of coloration right where you hear it the most, 2K and 1.5K and 3K and the area where the ear is really sensitive. They have all these just nasty, a lot of cancellations because you'll get, sound reflecting within the cone and off the whizzer cone. And the dispersion is just really weird and narrow at high frequencies, but also not smoothly narrow, really just erratic and horrible. That kind of speaker to me, I don't care what room it's in. It's just not going to sound good.
Yeah.
So I really disagree. We've heard that from so many writers over the years. The room is the most important thing. It is not. And here's my thought experiment. This is really more of a monologue here than a thought experiment, isn't it? But here goes. And here's monologue number 2.
Okay.
If I know you, I've gotten to know you pretty well over the last 20-something years. And if I'm in a room with you under, certain acoustics, right?
Mm-hmm.
You sound like Dennis Berger to me.
Mm-hmm.
And if we go outside or we go into a really reverberant, loud restaurant, or we go into a cave, or we climb to the top of a redwood tree 200 feet above the forest floor, you still sound like Dennis Berger to me.
Well, it's true. Although there might be intelligibility problems,
Well, yeah, sure. But you still sound like Dennis Berger. The timbre of your voice, my ear adjusts for the acoustical environment. Yeah. And I think to a significant degree, your ear does compensate. And your ear/brain does compensate. And are you going to sound good in an all glass room? Well, no, that's not going to sound too good. Yeah. But your ear does compensate, and your ear is going to hear that bad speaker, and that bad speaker is just going to sound bad in any environment. Yeah, but the good speaker is still going to sound probably okay in a significantly less than optimum environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and that's part of what Floyd Toole talks about in his book is that a properly designed loudspeaker should not be as sensitive to acoustics.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's a key thing. I really think that Floyd Toole will probably agree with me that no, the room will create giant swings in frequency response with any speaker, right? I mean, no speaker, I think you could go so far as to say, I don't think a speaker in a room is ever going to be flat.
No.
Whereas a speaker on its own can be really flat on axis. I mean, really flat. Yeah. But a speaker in a room is just not going to be flat. And
well, I mean, it's going to what different dimensions of rooms are going to determine, where your modes are and how the bass is. It's sort of from seat to seat degraded or what have you, where the spikes and dips are, but they're going to be there below the Schroeder frequency, and really sort of up to 2 octaves above. Any room is going to create problems with bass. Unless you have all of the acoustical treatments, the traps, or you're using something like, Dirac ART or what have you. Like there are going to be problems there. But yeah, I mean, look, even most of the speaker manufacturers still they don't design their speakers to be used in perfect rooms. I mean, I was talking to the guys at Paradigm a few years ago, and they were talking about how much the design of their speakers has evolved in the past 20, 30 years. Not merely because of research, but also because rooms are very different than they used to be. There are not as many soft surfaces in rooms as there used to be. Hardwood floors are more the norm. Bare surfaces, bare walls, large glass. I mean, all of these things, rooms just don't look like they did 30 years ago, and they are designing their speakers to account for that. So even the people making some of the best speakers out there, the best attainable speakers out there, are not building them for perfectly treated rooms. So that should tell you something.
And also, John's really kind of talking about how he's more inclined to go with manufactured solutions, the DIY solutions, and that's fine. It's hard to make DIY stuff look good. I will say that. It's really hard. You got to have some skills to do that.
That does sort of play into a point that he makes. He's got a list of 4 salient points, and the third one is, I take issue with this a little bit. He says strategic furniture placement can provide limited acoustical treatment. And then he sort of poo-poos the idea by talking about how the absorption coefficients are unknown, the placement is scattershot, whatever. But I got to say, I think a few very, very well-placed bookshelves can do way more than most people appreciate. I mean, in my 2-channel listening room, I've got 2 bookshelves behind my speakers, and I've got them stuffed all with either magazines, which are pretty thick, or thicker books, the coffee table type books, right? They honestly do the trick in terms of providing good absorption behind my speakers. There's nothing wrong with them, It goes back to something I've said many times before, which is, my distraction model of high fidelity. If they do a good enough job that I'm not hearing problems, that I'm not taken out of my music by going, oh, that's boomy, oh, whatever, then they're doing their job, right?
Yeah.
At this point, I think a lot of people in our hobby create distractions for themselves, and that's a problem. And I wish he gave a little bit more credence to what you can do with a few well-placed bookshelves. So
true. Well, John's European, and so they tend to have, at least in my own mind, they tend to have sparser, more stylish environments, and certainly their homes, on average, are older than ours.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And it's typically, very often constructed of more solid materials than ours. And they also tend to have furniture that's less, this giant plush overstuffed furniture is something that you don't really see much in Europe. It's kind of an American thing. So, our furniture basically is more absorptive than their furniture on average. I would say maybe you could do an AES paper on this, but you probably could. It's not a terrible idea.
Yeah. Well, and a lot more European speakers than American speakers are designed for corner loading, or very close placement to the wall. Basically, they're assuming more boundary gain because they're assuming your speakers are going to be right up next to the wall. So
probably so. That makes sense. Anyway, I think we want to recommend this article because really, no, the room is not the most important thing. Your speakers are the most important thing, but room is second, you could argue. And, unless you have a turntable, because a really bad turntable is pretty bad. But, there's no such thing as a horrible CD player or a DAC or anything like that. They're all at least reasonably okay.
Yeah.
But I think this is a great primer on acoustics for audiophiles, and it's written in language that you can understand very easily, and it has no digressions, and it doesn't have lengthy stories about how he visited some little village somewhere and got this great cup of coffee and blah blah, and he doesn't take 3 or 4 paragraphs to get to the point of the story.
Right. Well, and also like the fact that, for the bulk of it, for, 80% of the story, the information that he is giving you is genuinely educational and informative to the point to where you can get a lot from this article, even if you disagree with everything after his final subhead,
Oh, yeah. It really is a great explanation. I kind of wish I had written it.
Yeah.
I tended to get a little long-winded on this stuff.
Yeah.
And also I tended to put more jokes in. So.
Yeah.
All right. Are we ready to move on?
Yeah, let's move on, man. Let's go talk about American Scientist. Yeah.
Science.
All right. We'll be right back.
Go.
And welcome back to Audio. Oh, that was a little intimidating. Huh. Maybe no, let's not, we're not going to do that one going forward. I like the hillbilly effect better.
Unleashed.
That'll work. Okay, good. Anyway, this time around, we're talking about science. As I said in the intro, this is an article from American Scientist, which, I was surprised to come across an article about hi-fi in American Scientist. I'm normally reading, articles and papers about climate change and all manner of other things. And hey, here's an article in a science publication about what I do for a living. That's neat. But beyond that, I just thought it was a fascinating article overall. So the article is by John G. Behrens and Richard Van Everdingen. And the premise of it here is, as I said in the intro, they talk about objective quality versus subjective impressions of quality. And they talk about how with voice reproduction, that's really, really easy to do. And with music reproduction, that's really, really not easy to do. Right off the bat, I want to give a caveat here because there is a lot of room for bad faith interpretations. And
oh boy, is there.
One of the common criticisms that we hear with regard to speaker measurement is, oh, well, everybody hears differently, so the measurements just don't matter, and you can't measure sound quality. And, well, no, we have a lot of science to demonstrate that the things that we measure with regard to speaker measurements in an anechoic chamber actually have a very, very significant correlation to listener preference of those speakers. So you can measure two different speakers and look at the measurements and probably tell which one most people are going to prefer.
Right.
That is not what this article is about by a long shot. I mean, maybe it gets into that territory a little bit, but overall, it's more about like, hey, and it kind of plays back to the Atlantic article that we talked about. So they talk about the fact that with regard to music reproduction, stereo kind of rules supreme, and that, all of the different attempts at quad, surround formats, things like that, Atmos, haven't done anything to really improve the subjective impression of immersiveness, for lack of a better word. And eventually they talk about their own solution to it. But before we get there, I just wanted to sort of get your gut reaction to this article and your top level. What was your impression of this?
It's sort of like the opposite of the Darko article. I kind of disagree with a lot of their premises, but I agree with their conclusion, maybe. Because, look, I mean, there's been so much research done on this, and there's been so much, banding out about this idea that, well, we all hear differently, so nobody knows anything about audio. You have to go listen to it, and there's no way to predict, blah, 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 blah. And these guys aren't quite there, but they're kind of skirting that. And there was a great article that was done by the Harmon team. That's, AES article titled AES paper titled The Influence of Listeners' Experience, Age, and Culture on Headphone Sound Quality Preferences. And, they got 238 listeners of different ages, gender, and listening experiences. Okay. And they found out that people generally agreed on this stuff. And they were playing music, so the science that's out there kind of negates part of the premise of this article. Is that, and the premise of this article is that, well, we can't predict preferences for music reproduction, but we can. Now, that said, and we'll have a link to that article. I think it's actually, I'm an AES member, so I get it all for free, but I think it's actually one of the articles on the AES website that's available for free.
Nice.
So, and you should read it because there's just, it negates so much of what you read or see on YouTube or whatever, where people just like, well, there's you just don't know. Sounds totally personal, and everybody's got their own thing, and you got to go do your own thing, and MiFi is the way to go. And that is just wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean that people are always going to love a Harman Curve headphone, for example, which is the subject of this particular paper, but most of them will. Okay. Yeah. And the reasons that they, and especially this is all completely controlled blind testing, right? If you get into a normal consumer experience where people's perception of a product is grossly skewed by any number of prejudices involving, brand name, involving the design of the product, involving the technology the product uses, involving the price of the product, involving where the product is sold, involving what country the product comes from. Yeah. All these sort of things, that skews people's perspective. And, that's actually all fine because, we want people to be happy with their purchases. Right, and if someone's convinced that, say, China can't make a good tube amp, well, they're convinced of that. Well, fine, go buy a US made tube amp, whatever, even though you probably can't, or you could probably measure a difference, but it's probably not something you'd hear or, whatever. But, there's so many things that skew. And this is one thing I like about Wirecutter is we try to look at it from a holistic perspective and not just the sound quality. Whereas I think some publications just look at it purely from the sound quality standpoint and not from the ergonomics, not from the features, not from any of that stuff, but just like, what is it, whatchamacallit? Audio Science Review, the guy basically measures it and says, does it measure well? If it measures well, it is good. If it does not measure that well, it is bad. Yeah. And it deserves to be a panther with its head cut off or whatever his little code is. But,
But, I think with regard to that AES paper you're talking about, it's sort of like what I was talking about in the intro. Like we can definitely with measurements tell whether people will prefer one product to the other. But, I think what this research is really getting to the heart of is the fact that you can, like, let's say you're walking down a hallway and there's an open door and you hear the sound of a violin coming out of that door. You don't have to get very far into that room to know whether it's somebody playing a violin or somebody listening to a recording of a violin. Right. And I think that's sort of what they're getting to the heart of here is like, why does music reproduced over a hi-fi system not sound like live music? And I think a lot of this goes back to the sort of myth created by Harry Pearson that the absolute sound, the end goal, the whole point of hi-fi is to recreate the sonic experience of acoustical instruments in a real acoustical space. And, you and I think have disagreed about this before. Like I've never heard that illusion actually work. I've never listened to a hi-fi system and thought that in any way, shape, or form, I was actually listening to a convincing recreation of acoustic instruments in space. My point, though, is let's not who cares? Right?
I agree.
It's like, that's kind of like complaining that your camel doesn't get 95 miles to the gallon. It's no, that's not the point. Like a hi-fi system is not real instruments in a room. And I think this article does a pretty good job of explaining why, especially with regard to like the directivity stuff, the sound field created by something creating sound, as they explain it. And they do a good job of explaining why, like, a human speaking in a room actually radiates sound into the room very similar to the way a speaker does. A violin, on the other hand, does not. It's basically chaos with regard to directivity. And that is why a loudspeaker is never going to be able to truly recreate the illusion of an instrument in the room with you. So if you take it from that perspective, instead of, well, we can't really tell what people are going to like, I think it works better. Just requires you got to squint a little at it.
I would argue though that it does. These systems kind of can give you the impression of a real instrument in a room, even though they're radiating differently, right? Because the actual, if you're recording a violin in a room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the information about how that violin sounds in that room, not just the violin itself,
Mm-hmm.
that information is in the recording. And with a good set of speakers, you can get some of that. You can get, you've heard, stereo, you test stuff and it sounds like, I don't know, the violinist is right in the room with you. I've heard that a lot of times with a good system. And I think, though, that what they're really, the meat of their argument is actually somewhat similar to that guy from the Atlantic we were just talking about, where they're talking about the need for more of a replication of ambience.
Mm-hmm.
And, who can't get behind that? You want to feel, if you go to a real performance, and that could be a jazz club where they have a PA system. It could be the Beyonce concert at the Superdome. It could be an orchestra in a nice concert hall, whatever. You're going to get some sense of envelopment, right?
Yeah.
And with, a little pair of bookshelf speakers or something, you're probably not going to get that so much. You'll get some center imaging, you'll get some sound staging, you'll get some wraparound effect, right? If they're halfway decent.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be that compelling. And so I think that their solution here is not nutty.
No, do we want to talk about their solution a little? Because and moreover, do we want to ask the question: are these guys trying to make quad great again? Because
you could say that. You can say that. It's quad with dipoles, basically.
Yeah. Sort of dipoles, but sort of not. Yeah. So the solution that they suggest is stereo up front. That makes sense. And then two rear speakers that are diffuse surround speakers. And what it is that they're basically using a cone-shaped diffuser that radiates sound in all horizontal directions. And then they've got an absorptive block that keeps you from hearing that directly. So the only thing that you really hear is 300 degrees worth of sound bouncing off your walls, right? And the system that they set up allows you to dial in the balance between the direct sound from up front and the diffuse sound from the rear. And what's fascinating to me is they had 24 test subjects, and there was a really broad range of like, some people thought it sounded great, like at the minimum volume that you could play the diffuse surround speakers, and some people preferred it to where the diffuse speakers were actually louder than the front direct speakers. There didn't seem to be any statistically significant agreement on how this system sounded the best. But in the end, 23 of their 24 test subjects preferred some version of this over just plain stereo, which I thought was interesting.
Now, I should say the diffuse speakers they have, I'm gathering that it's basically a speaker driver firing into a conical diffuser, right?
Yeah, firing upward into a conical diffuser.
Upward into a conical diffuser, which has been done many, many times for many, many years. That only works on the high frequencies unless it's a very large diffuser. So I don't know. I'm not sure, maybe you could use the old THX dipoles where they radiated out of phase in opposite directions down to 500 hertz or something like that. And then they had a woofer for, below that.
We should point out that those largely existed in an era when your surround information was monophonic.
That's true.
Yeah.
But they weren't necessarily bad for Dolby Digital. Because they did create a more, diffuse natural effect on some soundtracks. It just depended. But, I think I'm not super excited about their speaker design, basically. But it's sort of like and you're actually blocked from getting the direct sound. There's like baffle there, that the
Right.
speaker is behind the baffle. So Canon made some surround speakers like this at one point, and they were almost exactly this design, and but they were intended to point towards you, and you mounted them on the wall. With this thing, you're going to have this baffle, and then the speaker's going to be behind the baffle. And from an industrial design standpoint, I'm not quite sure how you make that look decent. It's going to look weird. But those Canon speakers were only, they weren't omnidirectional. They were more like 270 degrees or something, right? And the omnidirectional aspect only really worked above like 7 kilohertz or something like that, right?
Wow.
That's what they told us in the press event. And because I remember David Renata, a revered audio journalist of yore, who I don't know what happened to him. He was really good. I worked with him some. He was at the press event. He's like, look, I'm looking at this lens here, and I'm kind of thinking like that doesn't work at any kind of low frequencies. What's at what frequencies does it start to become effective? And they're like, 7 kilohertz. And that was back before Dolby Digital. And he's like, you are aware that Dolby Pro Logic filters everything above 7 kilohertz out of the surround speakers, right? It was an embarrassing moment for them. Yeah. And but anyway, so you look at this design, it's like, well, okay, but I gotta say, I have sound bars that already do this. More or less, that have, that are Atmos sound bars that have multi-directional surround speakers, and they fire maybe forward, maybe to the side, but then upward, of course, for the Atmos thing. And
like the Samsung ones the first time I set that soundbar up, and it's like, wait, I've got surround speakers and there's an element pointing forward. What is going on here? And proof of the pudding's in the tasting. It sounded fantastic. Yeah,
but Samsung and LG are both doing this. Some others, I think Sony's also doing it. So, this is basically kind of already available. And no, the sound bar is not going to have, I think it's unlikely to have the kind of fidelity that a set of decent bookshelf speakers with a woofer and a tweeter would have. Although I would want to ask Alan Devantier at Samsung that question. I bet he's tested it, because they have in the Samsung testing facility, which is in Santa Clarita, California, they have a soundbar rotator switcher thing where you can actually rotate different sound bars in and out of position. So he might have tested this.
Yeah.
I could do a test on it, but it'd be way too hard to do a decent blind test on this. But they're also going to sound a lot different. But although some of the newer soundbars, I think you will agree, have really, shockingly good fidelity from the front speakers.
Oh, that Samsung Q, whatever it is, I can't remember. I would be like, if I didn't have to test AV receivers in my bedroom system, I would be super happy to have that Samsung, the flagship soundbar, instead of a AV receiver in separate speakers. I don't listen to a lot of music in that room. It's all movies or TV shows or something like that.
I'm mostly the same. I listen to music sometimes with sound bars, but not a whole lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's kind of, I would say that this is probably a good idea, except I really don't think that the industry would adopt this, because number one, they're kind of already doing it in many ways. And number two, they already have done it in many ways. And number three, consumers are not pining for better sound.
Well, and can I give you a number 4?
Sure.
This thing has to be tweaked to match the sort of recording environment of every different album that you feed it. They talk about the fact that you have to change this sort of diffuse surround field based on whether you're listening to something that was recorded in a studio or a large, orchestra hall or what have you. And it's like, come on, man. No, I don't want to be fussing around with balancing my speakers every time I change albums.
Yeah, but I got to say, you don't even need AI to do that. I mean, you can call it AI. You would call it AI. but you don't need to call it AI because you can easily detect the level of left minus right in the recording, which is, the ambience, right?
Yeah.
And you could easily automatically optimize the rear speaker level to accommodate that.
Yeah.
Couldn't you?
Yeah, I guess you could. But like they point out in the paper,
soundbars doing this already?
Yeah, like they pointed out in the paper, though, this isn't a product. This is just,
right.
their sort of research system for what it. But yeah, if it were a product, sure, I think they could do something like that. Yeah,
so I don't disagree with what these guys are saying. I disagree with. I don't want to say I disagree. I'm skeptical that anybody's going to want to do this because it's too much. This industry does have some memory, and there's too much throwback to quad. There's too much throwback to the old, AV receivers with, hall and stadium modes. And there's too much reluctance of consumers to put speakers back there unless it's maybe a high-end soundbar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for a music, and then you have the whole audiophile thing, which is at least as much cultural as it is artistic or musical. And audiophiles part of the hobby is their devotion to 2-channel. And that's fine. That's what they like. And that's what they're used to. And to convince them that they've got to put more speakers. Okay, here's my question to you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are the chances that, say, Steve Guttenberg would embrace this idea?
I mean, dude, if Chesky couldn't convince him to embrace surround sound,
yeah,
I don't think American Scientist is going to do it. So, although
probably not.
I have to say, my biggest takeaway from all of this is just like it is incredibly thrilling to walk into a bookshop in Montgomery, Alabama, and see a non-audio publication with big, bold letters on the cover, audio immersion, reproducing the joy of live music. I mean, that was just, we were going to talk about this article, whether it sucked or not, because I just think having mainstream coverage of this kind of stuff is exciting.
Yeah.
So I think we've ranted about this one enough, buddy. You want to wrap it up and do some credits?
It was a fun rant, though.
It was a fun rant, but we're running a little long, and I'm editing this one, so.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well,
yeah.
I'm going to say this is what do we call it again?
A Butterburger production.
Butterburger production. Why does this stick in my mind?
I don't know.
And the music is going to be probably dredged up old stuff that either of us did. What? I'm
calling it. I have been struggling with this percussion piece that I've been working on a while, and I just can't get it right. So I have decided, you know what? I'm going to set it aside for right now, and I'm just going to bang something out just to shake the cobwebs off and get us making music again. So, but before I get this one edited, I will at least have a new percussion track for you to make it sound like a real piece of music. So
cool. Well, I just learned the other day, I learned how to play Cold Gin by Kiss. So I will use some of that influence. I'll combine the influence of your weird percussion that's in 15/8 or whatever.
No, it's good. I'm just going to bang out something in 4/4, man. I promise.
Oh, that'll be good because Cold Gin, some mutated version of Cold Gin will fit right over that perfectly.
There you go. Okay.
It'll be awesome.
Cool. And I already said I'm editing and mixing and mastering this one. Do we have any other credits we need to do? No. I was going to thank Jeff, but most people aren't going to hear the article that Jeff sent to us. That's going to be for patrons. So I got nothing else. What you got, bud?
I'd like to thank God. And who do they thank at like the Grammys? I missed the Grammys this time.
Oh,
they always thank God. Oh, and they thank their
music
agent,
teacher. Yeah,
and their music teacher, and their agent, and their manager, and their record company, and I don't know. We don't have any of those things. We have nobody to thank but us and our patrons who support us, and our listeners who, even if they don't, we still love that you listen.
Yeah, and I was about to say, I want to thank you because this is always the highlight of my week when I just get to hang out and talk to you for a while. So
mine too.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dennis.
Yeah. All right.
Enough of this. Let's just cut this thing off.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Patrons, stick around. We got one more for you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you liked what you heard and wish there'd been a little bit more of it, we got some good news for you.
Indeed, we do. If you check out patreon.com/Audio Unleashed, all one word, you can get new episodes a little earlier than everybody else.
And sometimes it's like a day or two early. Sometimes it's nearly a week. We never really know until we start editing.
But the big plus is that you get extended cuts of every episode. And usually that's going to mean a whole extra segment that's about maybe a geekier topic or something that's a little more personal to us or something that's just going to really appeal to the hardcore Audio Unleashed listener.
Yeah, what it boils down to is if you're somebody who would support Audio Unleashed on Patreon, we're going to make sure the bonuses to every episode are really aimed straight at your interests.
Yeah, and so if you want to hear these segments, you can subscribe to our Patreon for $3 a month, which is less than I spend every single day on my cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks to write my boring articles.
Yeah. One more time with that URL, that's patreon.com/Audio Unleashed.
Or Audio
Unleashed. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.